Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, a look at the Arizona economy. Arizona's economy has been booming since the COVID-19 pandemic began to slow. Low unemployment, growing wages, and increasing population have persisted for years. But so have less positive indicators like inflation and skyrocketing housing prices. This week, we're at the Eller Economic Business Research Center's Breakfast with the Economists event at the La Paloma Resort in Tucson to talk with the featured speakers about recent economic conditions and what they see for the state's future. Up first is the EBRC's director, Dr. George Hammond. So you started off your speech in there talking about jobs, which I think the last time you and I talked, we were talking about jobs. Seems like a pretty popular topic. Arizona's seen some notable growth in recent years. Unemployment's been near record lows, if not record lows. Tell us about that and what you see for the future when it comes to jobs.
Yeah, Arizona's labor market is in strong shape. We're generating job growth at significantly faster than the nation. Our unemployment rate is about at the national level, near record lows in both cases. For Tucson, job growth is a little bit slower, but still, solid. A little bit slower than the nation and Arizona. But overall, the labor market really across the board is in pretty good shape. We are seeing a few signs of weakening around the edges of the labor market. So compensation growth is slowing both nationally and in Phoenix, which is the metro area that we have data for. And layoffs in Arizona are rising a little bit as are initial claims for unemployment insurance. But those are just some kind of clouds around the edges of an overall bright labor market.
So you also noted in your speech that inflation in Arizona is below the national average. Everybody's probably pretty happy about that, especially at the store and the gas pumps. But inflation related to housing is decelerating. How much was our area's inflation issue related to those fast rising rents?
That was a huge part of the reason why inflation in Arizona and Phoenix was so far above the national average, particularly in the summer of 2022. Housing is the biggest single component of the overall inflation measure. So, when you have, shelter prices, both rents and the owner's equivalent version of rents rising at double-digit rates, almost 20% over the year, that really drives overall inflation.
We were talking to some builders for single-family and multifamily homes recently, and they said the biggest thing that's dragging them down is interest rates. So how, as interest rates are going up, mortgages 6-7% at least right now, what's that going to do coupled with inflation?
Right, so we've seen house prices rise, 30-40% over the past, since the pandemic started. And at the same time, we've seen mortgage interest rates roughly double from 2022 to currently. And that is a recipe for just huge declines in housing affordability. Right, so if an individual purchased a house when interest rates are 3%, they're going to be reluctant to give up that 3% mortgage, move somewhere else, and take out a mortgage at a much more costly house at a double the mortgage rate. So it's having a lot of impacts. It's difficult for people who are moving to Arizona to find affordable housing. And it's also impacting, we think, migration into the state because people feel more stuck in the house that they're currently in.
We talked to a realtor recently who said, if you have one of those mortgages at 2-3%, it's better than winning the lottery economically at this point.
Right.
So growth in retail sales taxes, also an indicator of what's going on. For the state's two biggest metro areas, you called it anemic and noted that restaurant and bar taxes also slowed significantly, but the state's median income is up. So are people just not spending in stores and restaurants?
That's part of it. What's also happening is that inflation has come down significantly. So when we're measuring, taxable sales before adjusting for inflation, when inflation slows, that automatically brings down nominal taxable sales. So we expected that to happen to some extent. Their sales are below where we had expected them to be. So we think it's the level of prices is putting off consumers a bit. Everybody's feeling sticker shock every time they go to buy anything nowadays, and that's got something to do with it. But overall, we think that consumer spending is going to be okay going forward. Back to its roughly 2% growth rate as we look forward. Part of what you're seeing in taxable sales is that much of taxable sales is on goods, and we've seen a shift in consumer spending a bit away from goods towards other types of services. Restaurants and bars, of course, are taxed, but healthcare is a big service that we're all spending more and more money on, and that's not taxed.
Marketplace, the national business economics program that a lot of our stations air, recently did a whole series on Phoenix and business growth in Phoenix, looking especially at the semiconductor plants that are going in there. They're fueling a lot of growth. Is the state just riding on Phoenix's economic coattails?
Phoenix is by far the biggest metropolitan area in the state, so it's a major driver, and it's the fastest growing metropolitan area in the state, not only the biggest. So Phoenix drives the state's activity, that is for sure. In terms of the manufacturing, a lot of that manufacturing activity is still to come. So actually, if we look at manufacturing employment in Phoenix, those jobs are down over the year. In contrast, jobs are up over the year in Tucson, driven by aerospace. So, we think that, Phoenix is going to get those chip manufacturing jobs once the factories are completed, but that hasn't happened yet.
In the meantime, Southern Arizona, Tucson still has aerospace and other things going on. So, Zach, our producer, last week went on vacation to Long Beach without us, I want to point out, and he noticed that apartments a block from the beach, 2-bedroom apartments, were renting for what 2-bedroom apartments here in Tucson are renting for in the same neighborhood. Is this going to hinder population growth, which is so important to Arizona's economy, just those housing prices?
Yes, housing prices, housing affordability is the way to think about it, is going to affect the competitiveness of Arizona. I think we're still going to be competitive versus most of the metropolitan areas in California. So, if you look at LA, 2.7% of the homes sold in LA at the end of 2023 were affordable to a family making the median. San Diego, that was 4%, whereas, Phoenix is at about 22%, Tucson is higher, about 35, 36%, I think. So we're still more affordable than California. It's really our competitiveness versus places like Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, even Washington.
Okay, so we don't have to worry about Zach leaving us for the beach quite yet.
Well, I hope not.
Thanks for spending some time with us.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.
George Hammond is the director of the Eller Economic and Business Research Center at the University of Arizona. You're listening to The Buzz. After the break, an economist talks about what may be one of the state's most limiting factors for economic growth: water. Stay with us.
I'm Rachel Martin. You probably know how interview podcasts with famous people usually go. There's a host, a guest, and a light Q&A. But on Wildcard, we have ripped up the typical script. It's a new podcast from NPR where I invite actors, artists, and comedians to play a game using a special deck of cards to talk about some of life's biggest questions. Listen to Wildcard wherever you get your podcasts, only from NPR.
Welcome back to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. We're at the Eller Economic and Business Research Center's Breakfast with the Economist event, talking about the state of Arizona's economy and what experts see ahead. The opening image of Dr. Sharon Megdal's presentation at the event led with an eye-catching question: is Arizona running out of water? Dr. Megdal is the director of the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center. She's also served on the board of the Central Arizona Project, the American Water Resources Association, Governor Katie Hobbs' Water Policy Council, and the Arizona Corporation Commission. She joins us now. So I have to say, Sharon, we were a little surprised when we were doing research for this, not to see you as the guest speaker at an event called Breakfast with the Economists, but that you have a PhD in economics from Princeton. So start telling us a little bit about the intersection between water and the economy.
My answer to that story may not be as direct as you would like, Chris, because first of all, just at the personal level, my nexus between economics and water really is a nexus of a meandering career path, and I became involved in water from the real world side of things, not from the academic side of things. And so I mention that because how I got involved in water here in the region was really through leading up a regional water augmentation district that was established in the early 90s and then was not made permanent. It was probably 20 years before its time. But while training-wise, book-wise, I'm trained as an economist, my water training is much more on-the-job, real world. And so my connection to water and economics is really one of bringing my framework of thinking about issues and resource scarcity. Economics is really about the scarcity of resources and how they get allocated and priced, combined with the very practical aspects of how water is managed, which is its own thing. And so fundamentally, I've combined the two, and the two are combined in the real world, in that you can't have an economy without the water to support it. But having the water to support it really involves a lot of effort on the part of a lot of people in making sure we're using it wisely and so forth. So it's become intricately entwined in my professional career, but also kind of in what I do from the outward perspective.
Water is a good, is a service, but it's not like other goods and services. Is that just because it's finite, or is there more to it than that?
Water is very different from other goods and services, and I'm going to meander here a little bit of my response. When you study economics, this is economics 101, and I don't know if they still talk about it. They probably do. I looked it up on Google. They talk about the diamond water paradox, and they say, why are diamonds so expensive and water is so cheap when water is essential for life and diamonds are not? And they explain the paradox in terms of supply and demand, that the supply of diamonds is very limited, it takes a lot to extract the diamonds, and you pay a lot because of that. And water was viewed as more plentiful, but water isn't necessarily plentiful. It's certainly not plentiful for us here in the Sonoran Desert, and yet its pricing is strange. You know, we price it based on the cost of extraction, the cost of delivery, the cost of administration, but not the water scarcity itself. We don't pay for the water molecules. So we have a very strange good. Water is essential to life. It is scarce, yet it's priced in a way that we don't recognize that scarcity. And I'll just give you a real quick example just for background. Economics teaches a good or service should be, if it's not a kind of perfect market dictated by supply and demand, prices should somehow reflect the next best alternative. And our next best alternative is not free water pumped from the ground. It's maybe desalinated water, or it's recycled water that goes through a lot of treatment, or maybe it even becomes some more imported water. But basically, by not pricing water according to its next best alternative, we're not sending the right signals to consumers. So it's different in so many ways. Water is different in so many ways from other goods and services. And yet we need it for life. We need it for everything that we do.
So you bring up a lot of interesting things about water and why it's different. Most of Arizona's water, which you well know, I think it's about 72%, is used for agriculture. And we hear a lot of talk about cutting water to farmers. If Arizona decides to move away from agriculture, which is a big economic driver for us, how would that affect our lives? And would our overall economy take a notable hit as far as jobs and GDP and things like that?
I think one runs into difficulty answering that kind of question because you could answer it from the gross numbers of state domestic product, or you could say, well, we wouldn't feel anything very much about that in Tucson. But what about the families and the communities that depend on that agriculture? They will feel it severely. And so this again relates to economics in that we typically don't have ways of compensating people when we're taking something away from them. However, actually in the here and now, if people are reading and listening to what's going on, we are compensating farmers for using less water. We are trying to enter into voluntary arrangements with farmers as opposed to just, we're taking your water, you don't have it anymore. We don't have the flexibility necessarily to do that, nor do we necessarily want to do that. And by flexibility, agriculture has some senior rights to surface water. They have some senior rights to Colorado River water. If we as a community, as we as a collective want to see agriculture use less water, we need to think of ways to incentivize that, to alleviate the burden on the farmers, on the communities, and that is going on to a certain extent. But there are concerns that if farming goes away, some of the rural character of Arizona will go away. And so it's not only measured in dollars and cents, but it's also measured in how our communities thrive more generally. These are tough questions, but I will say this, just to mention, is for a long time there had been efforts by farmers themselves or by others to incentivize farmers to become more efficient, to use less water to grow their crops. But that less water hasn't necessarily been saved and used for another purpose, such as helping communities grow, if that's what the desire of the public is. And instead, sometimes that saved water ended up being used for more agriculture. So now some of the discussion is, okay, can we enter into agreements with agriculture? Can we see them use less water and have that water quantified and saved, whether it's to leave it in Lake Mead, to keep Lake Mead up for deliveries in the future, or whether it's to, some people don't like this, to transfer that water to other users. So it's really a complicated puzzle that we're working on.
Talking about other users, we hear the phrase that a lot of farmers are now growing houses instead of crops. Growth has been, for the last decade for Arizona, 100 to 150,000 people a year. That's projected to continue. From a water standpoint, is that going to be the biggest limiting factor for our growth?
Water is, and it's going to remain a factor to consider when we have growth, as it should. I mean, we live in the desert. We should not be selling properties and lands if there's not the water to serve them. But then again, things are nuanced. What do you mean by limiting factor? Do you mean it's going to limit and it's not going to happen and we're going to put gates around communities limiting growth? Or is it that we're going to have to plan for that, acknowledge that, make plans and take actions to address that? Some people think water should never be the limiting factor of growth, but there are natural limitations of a region. So I do think that for the most part, we in Arizona are recognizing that it is the responsible thing, it is the necessary thing to make sure communities and businesses have the water that they need over the long term. But I will say that's not necessarily required in all parts of Arizona. While it is in the metropolitan area of Tucson and the like, it's not everywhere. So yeah, we have to recognize that we need to adapt to our water situation, and that may mean growth looks a bit different than it might have in the past.
You coined a phrase during your presentation this morning, the wicked water problems. So what are those problems and why do they stand out as the big wicked problems?
Wicked problems are problems that they're big and they're not easy to resolve, and they may change over time. And so one of the examples I use, the first example I'll typically use, is the imbalance of supply and demand on the Colorado River, looking at the whole basin. The river's over-allocated, it has been, and the river's shrinking in terms of the water it's producing on an average annual basis. And that's a problem. The West is growing, it's going to continue to grow. We want recreational opportunities. We want everything from what's becoming a more and more limited resource. So the question is, what do we do? How do we try to get demand and supply into balance? What other water sources can we bring to bear? Communities are working on this. A lot of times, something I do like to point out that sometimes my scientist colleagues who work on climate change and climate change adaptation, and they really focus on this concept of adaptation. And what I say to them is people are adapting all the time to these changing circumstances. They're just not necessarily out there waving the flag, look at me, I'm adapting. But they are, and we are all the time. And so that's a great example of where we're just constantly working on how to deal with these shortfalls in the Colorado River, how to make sure our individual communities are resilient and grow. And there's no one answer for any one of them, and even if you think you have an answer or a response or a solution, it may only be partial and things may change. And so the idea is that you work on mitigating or adapting to these circumstances, but it's almost a never-ending process. Now, sometimes money can be brought to bear, and I'll give you another example that I didn't talk about this morning of a wicked water problem that I sometimes bring up, and that's the access to water. And I will bring up the wicked problem that really came to the forefront for the Navajo Nation during COVID, when it was realized that the lack of running water impacted communities' ability to wash hands, to do some of the things that needed to be done. You even had intergenerational housing that was much more prevalent, where you couldn't necessarily isolate those who were sick or elderly. And this is the lack of water availability is chronic in that area, but it became an acute issue. But now we're looking at a water settlement that, if it comes to bear, would include a lot of financial resources to address that. And so sometimes money can help, but it's not the only solution to these problems.
So let me read back something you had on one of your slides in there. It was your last slide. It said, quote, "I'm optimistic that we can adapt to changing circumstances because we've been adapting and because failure is not an option," close quote, which is something we were just talking about, that adaptation. Are we being pessimists by being so concerned about this issue that you think will fix, or is there a necessary level of concern that needs to be in there?
That's a great question. So over the years, I'll often say we need to be vigilant, we need to be activist or excited about water. This is one of the things I've said, that I want people to be excited about water so they're aware of it, they take the appropriate actions and understand the implications of their own behavior. But historically, I have not said we should be alarmed about it. Pessimism is, to me, a mood, right? Are you optimistic, are you pessimistic? Is the glass half full or the glass half empty? It's both. But what you focus on, to me, is important, because if you're pessimistic, as somebody working on water resources, it's hard to have the energy and enthusiasm to go work on it. It's kind of like, oh, getting out of bed, you're going to work on this. So to me, when I think about optimism and pessimism, and this question comes up in a lot of audiences these days about, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? And I've been criticized for being too optimistic, but I'm not going to apologize for that, because I am optimistic that we can do the work and we can do the things that it requires, but there's a lot of work to be done. But I do want to mention one thing, and recently I was quoted by Tony Davis in an article where I said I was alarmed, and that's not a term that I usually use. And it was an article about whether or not Glen Canyon Dam would be able to have the water flow down to the lower basin if the water levels in Lake Powell got too low. And what came out in a study from the Bureau of Reclamation was there's this cavitation that's gone on, and it was saying that, wow, we may not be able to operate the system the way we thought we could. And that to me was alarming. And so I'm going to be honest and give my own personal assessment of things, but I think being concerned, being aware, that's all fine. But if you're pessimistic, I don't think we'll get to where we need to be, and I think we have to get to somewhere where we're not becoming a ghost town. You know, one time, I'll tell you another quick story. I don't know if you ever, and you have to remember the play, which I don't remember, but if you ever saw the show Urinetown. And both ASU and U of A were doing productions on it, and the student assistant director, whatever, up at ASU wanted to talk about long-term outlook. And I gave him a view of what the long-term outlook could be. If the Colorado River went dry, what might our communities, like a community like Tucson, look like? We're not going to become a ghost town, but we could be smaller than we are now. We could see disruptions to property values. But I think it's our job not to see that sort of thing happen and be prepared. And the other thing I sometimes point out is we're in the old Boy Scouts building. I didn't do that this morning because I was short on time. But what's the motto of the Boy Scouts? Be prepared. And that's a good motto for a building that's a water center, because I think we have to be prepared. And I think that our water managers are working very hard for us to be prepared. But it is going to take all of us, and that's why it's all hands on deck. It's every one of us.
All right, well, thanks for sitting down with us.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Sharon Megdal, director of the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center. And that's the buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcast. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer with production help from Desiree Tucker. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
AZPM's original productions are made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by donations from listeners like you. Learn more at support.azpm.org.